reformist, mainstream solutions. We also call them superficial solutions. And the third, which is what I guess many of us are talking about, dreaming and trying to actually push for, is much more fundamental and radical transformations. We already see, in some senses, these beginning to take place. For instance, in behavioral change, much more acts of solidarity, even in the midst of highly selfish, individualized societies. We're seeing it all over the world. We're seeing people beginning to ask themselves, okay, do I really need to fly around so much? Do I really need to consume so much, etc.? And I think the more we can push that kind of rethinking and reimagination and cultural shifts in our own minds and hearts and souls, the more we might be able to put this dream of fundamental change into reality. Now, one of the things we do in the book, and I think that's very important, is when we say alternatives, we have to say alternatives to what? It's not about alternatives to garbage being recycling. It's really why so much garbage being produced in the first place, right? So alternatives mean we have to fundamentally challenge the structures which create unsustainability and inequality and oppression. Capitalism, statism, patriarchy, much older than either of those, racism, and so on. And so therefore, when we talk about systemic or radical alternatives, it is really those which challenge these fundamental structures and do not let them remain with only some amount of greenwash. Secondly, and I think Federico mentioned this, but I want to emphasize this, we're not talking about mainstreaming alternatives, because the whole idea of mainstreaming is that there's one big river which will flow and then everything else will get washed away. We're actually talking about thousands, millions of streams being able to coexist. So that's the pluriverse, that's very important. And as he said, we have 90, 100 essays of different kinds, both on practical alternatives, such as agroecology, which is a huge movement around the world, or the transition movement, or in many cases, eco-villages, so many other kinds of actual practical, where there are thousands of initiatives around the world, but also conceptual ones. Both those that are being revived from ancient times, like the ones he mentioned, like Ubuntu and Buen Vivir and Kyosai and Munabetsivian and many others, from indigenous peoples, local communities, etc. And also those that are emerging from the, let's say, the belly of the beast, you know, the industrialized society, that's eco-socialism, eco-feminism, degrowth, as he mentioned, and many others. And also we have, and this is very, very important, the reinterpretation of mainstream religions, of the big religions, to see, okay, how do those also reimagine the world from a much more radical perspective. I want to put on a couple of slides so that I can explain a little bit more of the kind of common threads that run through these different alternatives, even as they are extremely diverse. So if I can, I'm going to try and share screen. And John, let me know if this is working.
It's working.
Great. So if you see the kinds of alternatives we're talking about, they can broadly be put into these 5 overlapping spheres. One is where people are talking about political autonomy and self-rule. Like we have a village in central India which says, we elect the government in New Delhi, but in our village, we are the government. We will be the ones taking the decisions with regard to all of our collective, whatever is supposed to, whatever will be affecting us. So from that to also actually reimagining political boundaries, nation state boundaries, etc., looking at ecoregions and bioregions across much larger landscapes. How do you look at a completely revisited politics? The second on the right-hand side is economic democracy. So instead of economic globalization, which is what has brought the world to the current crisis, including the COVID one, we're talking about economic localization. We're talking about the means of production being in the hands of producers, not in the hands of capitalists or the state. We're talking about the economy of care, which he so beautifully brought out by acknowledging his partner, Federico's partner, the economy of care, the economy of share, and the non-monetized economy as being as important as anything else. The third on the bottom right-hand side is very important, because even the right wing in many cases is talking about localization. But when they say localization, they mean we don't want migrants here. We don't want refugees here. We're talking about an open localization, which also includes then the struggles for social justice, for gender justice, for removing casteism, racism, and so on. Fourth, culture, very, very critical. We have an incredible diversity of languages and cultures and foods and so on across the world, which is all being homogenized in the name of development. We have to fight against that and be able to respect the diversity of knowledges, the diversity of cultures, etc. And fifth, of course, on the top left-hand side, maybe we can think of that as being cross-cutting, because without protecting the earth, we're all dead in any case. What I also want to do is to point to, to what Federico mentioned in terms of a common thread of values and principles. Of course, there is this tension that we can't think of these as being universal in a pluriverse, but they are, at least the hundreds of examples that I know of alternatives, are kind of showing some or more or all of these in one way or the other. And this set of principles, and many others that I'm sure you can all think of, is in direct contradiction to what the mainstream dominant economy and polity and society is telling us. They're in contradiction to so much of what the cultural hegemony of the West has given to the world. I'm not going to go into these, we don't have the time, but maybe in the discussion, we can pick up any of these that people want. I can bring the slide back on. And so therefore, one of the biggest questions, and I'm going to end with this in a minute, one of the biggest questions is, how do all these different movements around the world of all kinds, if I'm just mentioning a few here, and like Federico said, we have 100 in the book, how do they actually make for the macro shifts that we need, and not just remain in their own isolated pockets? That is really the most important task ahead of us. Both the resistance to the dominant society, the dominant system, and these pluriverse of alternatives. So one of the initiatives that we've started a few months back is this thing called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, a horizontal, distributed, not top-down way of trying to weave together all these different fantastic things that are happening around the world in maintaining their own identity, but also linking with each other to create a much larger change. You already mentioned the two websites, and I put them on the chat, but there's much more available of what I just said on these websites. So for the moment, thanks a lot, and I'll be happy to respond to the discussion. Thank you.
Beautiful, Ashish, thank you. And of course, my worst nightmare as a teacher and webinar host has occurred, and I was not recording until about 2 minutes into Ashish's remarks, but at least we are recording now. I'm going to blame my 3 excellent teaching assistants for not immediately texting me. But no, they know I'm joking. We'll speak next. Susan Paulson will speak next to us. Susan has researched and taught in Latin America for 3 decades. She teaches at the University of Florida. She is well known in the field of degrowth and has published a book called Degrowth, Culture, Power, and Change, a great article called Pluriversal Learning, Pathways Toward a World of Many Worlds, which for the teachers among us and the students and future teachers among us should be a must read. And most recently, the piece with others, including Georgos, called From Pandemic to Careful Degrowth. And I'm stumbling over my words, but Susan won't. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, John, for bringing together so many cherished partners in these ongoing explorations of Pluriverse. Today, I want to think about plural approaches to provisioning, care, and vulnerability. The pandemic opens possibilities to think about the world in new ways. Without essential workers, none of us could thrive. Unless vulnerable community members are protected, even the most privileged are not safe from contagion. So in every society, contributions to provisioning, care, and also vulnerabilities to harm are organized by economic systems, by kinship systems, and also by gender, which is what I want to talk about today. So my own path to appreciating Pluriverse has taken me through very diverse gender arrangements in the Andes and Amazon. But I want to look now about plural identities and arrangements closer to home, perhaps in our own homes of the people that are here present today in the context of pandemic. And I make a case for broadening our own horizons of innovation by recognizing a pluriverse of gender arrangements in the world. So we all know that different actors suffer different vulnerabilities to coronavirus and also to the economic downturns that follow. I recently reviewed more than 30 articles on feminist and gender responses to COVID. It's wonderful to see the circulation of all these different perspectives, from women's empowerment to feminist degrowth. And it was pretty disappointing to see that almost none of them talked about men or other gender identities. So how can we look in a more integral way at really the plurality of beings and identities that interact to make our world? One broad example is gender-based violence, where people are often talking about how women suffer a disproportionate share of domestic violence. But in the Americas, men are victims of around 90% of the homicides, 70% of suicides, and 95% of occupational deaths. And so we have really a more complex panorama of gendered violence that I'd like to look at in a more integral way. So coming to COVID, you've probably been reading in the newspaper that in almost every country, men are dying with much more frequency than women, in some countries 2.2 times as much. And this intersects with racial and ethnic identities, so the most vulnerable people to the disease are non-white men. So researchers are asking, what are all the different causes, what's going on? There's clearly a lot of braided together issues. But I want to look briefly at identities, occupations, and places. So all over the world, women are outliving men by growing gaps, as many as 13 years. And scientists are finding some of the factors have to do with disdain for healthcare, limited social connections, and risk-taking that are connected with masculine identities. Recent COVID research found in some contexts men twice as likely as women to go without masks or to break quarantine, saying things like, it's men's own fault that they get sick. So, this is the thing about Pluriverse, and both Ashish and Fede mentioned already, it's so hard to keep respect for all the different paths and have compassion for all the paths rather than judging from one place. And I'm wondering if we've learned compassion for women whose conditions lead to lack of self-esteem, initiative, necessary to make dignified lives. Why about compassion for men and boys whose conditions push them to show virility by risking violence, enduring violence, practicing it? Anyway, we've heard a lot in occupations about nurses, healthcare aides, mostly women who are vulnerable. In every country, there's millions of men, every region, millions of men performing sanitation workers, food harvesters, meat packers, truck and bus drivers, essential to public health, who are doing jobs that were already amongst the most dangerous and deadly in the world, and now they're connected to exposure to coronavirus. So the last piece to think about is places. We have a plurality of ways of being and homes in the world. Home is not a shelter for everyone. Some homes are sites of domestic violence, which seems to have intensified recently. But some people don't live in homes. Residents of long-term care centers are more women because they live longer. But in almost every country, men make up the majorities, as high as 90% in prisons, jails, migrant worker camps, homeless shelters, immigration detention centers, military barracks, all of which have become hotspots for the virus. So basically what I want to ask and bring into this conversation is, how can we build gender systems, social systems that recognize plural contributions and plural sacrifices, not only around the world, but also in our own communities, in our own home? And I'm going to finish just with a few slides, if I manage. Let's see if I can pull them up. We see this slide?
Got it.
All right, you guys, I think everyone here must know these families. They've taught you pretty much since you were born that Homo sapiens, since the Stone Age to the supersonic future, live in nuclear families where a man sells his labor to earn money and the woman does the caretaking. That portrayal is a problem for a number of reasons. And I think we've seen that stereotype expressed in public health messages about COVID. Stay at home with your family, women are doing more labor in the family, etc. But in fact, in the US, only 20% of people live in nuclear families. And in all of the wealthy nations, the largest household type is a single person living alone. 27% of US and Canadians live alone, 40% of Swedish people, which is about a whole different level of care and provisioning and need that we need to be paying attention to. Another question is, when the public health officials keep assuming one universal model of household living and family and care, it not only is really bad for public health because it's empirically incorrect, but it communicates some normative judgment that other ways aren't right. And that, for example, any variation of masculinity would be wrong, right? Would be something that we should be ashamed of. So I'm going to just end by showing some alternatives that widen our horizon. And what I'm going to propose is that we recognize and honor all kinds of gender identities and relations during and beyond COVID, and motivate all kinds of people to experiment and innovate for kinder and gentler systems with a much wider range of ideas of what are the ways that we can find identity and meaning and connect with each other in this world that will help us through these challenges. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you, Susan. So again, we are in the middle of a webinar called Post Everything Worlds, a Pluriversal webinar. And our next speaker is our third co-editor of the book Pluriverse. Alberto Acosta will speak to us from Ecuador in Spanish. And my wonderful students, Julian Sanchez and Eduardo Enriquez, will summarize for those who don't speak Spanish his words more briefly after he speaks. Alberto has an incredible set of background skills, including, sorry, Susan, your timing was so good, less than 8 minutes. I don't know any academic who could do that. Alberto is a university professor currently, but he's been Minister of Energy and Mines. He's been president of the Constituent Assembly, and he's been a candidate for president of Ecuador. He's also been involved with the Great International Tribunal of the Rights of Nature. And as he says in Spanish, compañero de ruta de movimientos sociales, fellow traveler, which I never heard in Spanish. That's very cool. So anyway, now over to you, Alberto.
Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches. Me van a disculpar que empiece hablando en español y que termine hablando en español, porque mi inglés es muy malo. He tenido oportunidad de vivir un tiempo en los Estados Unidos, pero amigos y amigas entrañables como Susan me hablaron siempre en español. No pude mejorar nunca mi inglés. Hace como 6 años me encontré por primera vez con Ashish Kothari y conversamos en Alemania sobre experiencias comunes. Él me transmitía sus conocimientos, sus experiencias que venían de lo más profundo de las comunidades de la India. El pensamiento, la práctica del esbarrar. Y yo le comentaba algo que había aprendido de las comunidades indígenas de los Andes y de la Amazonía. Yo no soy un indígena, yo no vivo en una comunidad indígena, pero habría aprendido mucho y entre los dos comenzamos a pensar en la idea de establecer puentes y se sumó Federico Demaria, que venía con lo que ya escuchamos, las visiones del decrecimiento. Y resolvimos hacer un primer artículo en línea con algo que me parece que es fundamental. Tender puentes entre el norte global y el sur global y también entre los grupos del sur global. No podemos esperar a que los poderosos del planeta se pongan de acuerdo y entonces recién comenzar a encontrar soluciones. Las soluciones existen en diversas partes del mundo, como decía Ashish, no cientos, miles, quizás millones de alternativas. Lo que no hay es la gran receta. Menos mal, esa es una gran noticia. Y en ese sentido surgió el libro. A los 5 años tuvimos un libro, y aquí les muestro la versión en español. Este libro ya está en España, está en América Latina en varios países, está en camino en portugués y está en camino en italiano y en otras lenguas. En este libro se recogen experiencias, valores. Como se dice también en el libro, si hacemos un poco de silencio, vamos a oír respirar al futuro. El futuro está en marcha. Pero hay un asunto. Y en estos días, con la pandemia, con la cuarentena, tengo el libro a mi mano y he reflexionado mucho lo que el libro aporta. Y me pregunto si en realidad estamos entendiendo lo que sucedió. Hace pocas semanas, hace pocos meses, veíamos cómo se destruía con incendios la Amazonía, Australia, varios países en África, en Indonesia. ¿Por qué? Porque hay una demanda de recursos naturales de un sistema que genera muerte, destrucción y desperdicio. Y en ese escenario también me he preocupado sobre la realidad de millones de personas que sufren hambre y cuya vida se ha visto tremendamente afectada por la pandemia. ¿Cuántas personas se pueden quedar en casa? Ya Susan mencionaba eso. Gente que no tiene casa, gente que no tiene ingresos, gente que no tiene ahorros para vivir. Esta es la realidad del mundo. Y yo me pregunto si es que realmente la humanidad y sus líderes han entendido realmente lo que esto significa. ¿Vamos a regresar a la normalidad? ¿Vamos a volver a la anormalidad? Me temo que muchos gobernantes e incluso víctimas del sistema están pensando que hay que regresar a la normalidad. Regresar a la normalidad sería volver a la anormalidad y eso sería muy lamentable. Yo rescato algo fundamental. Los gobernantes, el poder, seguirá su camino. Pero quienes hemos entendido el mensaje profundo de esta pandemia, tenemos que recuperar algo que me parece básico y fundamental. La comunidad, las comunidades, la vida en comunidad, la autosuficiencia, la solidaridad, la reciprocidad, la cooperación, la sustentabilidad. Comunidades humanas y comunidades naturales. Somos comunidad, somos naturaleza. Y de eso habla este libro. Este libro habla del Kyosei en el Japón, de la comunalidad, de la convivialidad, del esbaraj, del ubuntu, del buen vivir, de las ecoaldeas, de los bienes comunes. Hagamos un enorme esfuerzo de memoria para que no nos cuenten lo que hemos vivido. Esta es una experiencia de individuos y de comunidades. Hagamos realidad un mundo donde todos los mundos puedan tener un espacio, pero importante. Todos los seres vivos podamos vivir con dignidad. Esa memoria que nos sirva para cambiar nosotros, construir comunidades y transformar el mundo. Les abrazo desde los Andes.
Muchas gracias, Alberto. I'm hoping that Julian and Eduardo are there to further tell us some of what Alberto has already said to us.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning, John. Gracias, Alberto, por compartir todo lo que dijo. And now I'm going to try to do my best to translate what we could get. I'm personally not the fastest at typing, so there's definitely a lot of information that I was not able to write down, but I will do my best. So Alberto begins by saying, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. You will have to excuse me that I will start speaking Spanish as my English is not that good. And correct me if I am wrong at some point. Por favor, Alberto, si me equivoco en algo, por favor, corríjame. I had lived in the USA, but people spoke in Spanish to me Therefore, I never improved much my English. About 6 years ago, I met a certain person who I didn't quite get the name, who I talked to him about the communities from the Andes. I am not indigenous, but both of us started to think about the idea of building bridges. We did an article about something I consider fundamental. We cannot wait until the powerful people of the world agree and begin to start finding solutions. Solutions are there in diverse parts of the world, hundreds, even millions of alternatives. This is how we came up with the book. This book is available in Spain, in Latin America, and soon it's going to be on its way in Italian and Portuguese. As we say in the book, if we make some silence, we will hear the future breathe. In these days of COVID, the COVID pandemic, I have reflected on what the book has to offer and we have learned about all this. A few days or weeks ago, we heard about the destruction in places such as Australia, and I couldn't quite get the name of the other region. But in this scenario, I thought about the lives of people who suffer hunger due to the pandemic. People with no home or income or savings. This is the reality of the world. I wonder if humanity and its leaders have understood that. Will we go back to normal or abnormal? I fear that many victims of the system want to go back to what they consider normal, but that will be going back to abnormality, and that will be detrimental. We must recover something that I find essential, which is autosufficiency and living in communities, cooperation, sustainability, and natural communities. We are community and we are nature. This book talks about el buen vivir and common goods. This is an experience, I couldn't quite get that, but Alberto finishes by saying all human beings can live with dignity and transform communities in the world.
Gracias, Eduardo, lo has hecho muy bien, mejor que yo.
No, muchísimas gracias y disculpe que no pudimos.
No, lo has hecho perfecto, hombre, mejor que
Gracias.
yo. Gracias.
Un saludo.
Gracias a todos. Our final presenter today will be Georgos Kallis, who teaches at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and could speak to us equally in English and Spanish, of course, and probably Greek. Georgos is known as one of the principal advocates of the theory of degrowth. What might be less known about him, and I hope we'll get it in the chat, is he maintains a wonderful, rich website for teachers and students in their sort of professionalization in the best sense of the word, how to write better, how to communicate better. It's very rich and I recommend it to everyone. So Georgos is not only teaching us, he's teaching us how to teach. And now over to you, Georgos.
Thank you, John, and thank you for organizing this and for inviting me. I wanted to talk, let me also count myself to make sure I don't go over time. I wanted to talk about one of the keywords that appear in the Pluriverse book, degrowth, as you said, because I'm someone who, among many others, who the last years have been working on this keyword. I didn't write the keyword in the Pluriverse book. Actually, I wrote a criticism of one of the bad keywords that was in the book, the eco-modernism. But I would like to take this opportunity to reflect a little bit on the keyword of degrowth on the light of a new book that we just finished. We are on the proof stage with Susan and Federico, two of the previous speakers, and Giacomo D'Alisa, who is not here, which we call the case for degrowth. And some of you might have taken a glimpse of that. We just published the preface to the book, where we relate degrowth to the actual crisis, to the actual public health and economic crisis. And I want to talk a little bit very briefly about that. So for those of you who might not be familiar with where this keyword comes, degrowth is a word that emerged in the 1980s in France. It was launched by social movements, ecological movements and anti-globalization movements who were fighting for a slower pace of life, a slower economy, a different economy, an alternative economy. And in trying to articulate their mobilizations and their struggles, they took inspiration from ideas that they were out there in the 70s, from ecological economists like Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who was talking about the slowing down of the growth economy, and other French political ecologists like André Gortz, who was also saying that if we are to take seriously the idea that there are limits to growth, then we have to think of how do we slow down capitalism, how do we do something different, and how do we degrow. He was one among of the first to use the term. How do we degrow production and consumption? These movements in France found inspiration by this word. They used it as a keyword. They used it as the title of a magazine they issued, and that was reaching 100,000 people or more in France. There was a lot of mobilization in the 90s and 2000s in France around the word degrowth. And suddenly, through the work of Serge Latouche, an economic anthropologist who was working in Africa and became more and more disillusioned over time with the export of Western type development into Africa, he started writing a series of books on the idea of degrowth as a critic to the idea of a one-way type of development and one way of sustainable development. We brought this keyword here in Barcelona in 2010 after the first conference in English when the word degrowth in English was used. And we brought it here in Barcelona in 2010 for the second international conference. And since then, we have a small group of scholars and activists here in Barcelona, around 10 to 20 people, depending on the year, that we try to develop research and communicate the idea of degrowth. So why degrowth, and what do we mean by that? We mean, first of all, a critique to the dominant ability of this pursuit of continuous GDP growth, 2 or 3% per year. We criticize that not only for its ecological implications, but also for its social and at the end also economic irrationality. The idea that you can have a global economy growing 3% every year, up to 11 times bigger by the end of this century, is a mad idea. We joke a little bit in our book with Susan, no? And we say that it's as mad as, when we study ancient civilizations, we say, like, how could the ancient Greeks that invented philosophy, how could they believe that there were 12 gods living on a top mountain and they were masquerading as bulls to have sex, and they were doing all these stupid things? How is it that they believed that, no? Or then we say, how could the Aztecs sacrifice all these thousands of people, for the sake of a ritual up in the pyramids, And we say that it's very similar to what is going on right now. The amount of things, people, lives, livelihoods we are sacrificing on the altar of a mad idea, of an idea that it's not rational at the end of the day. It doesn't live up to the standard of Western rationality, this idea that the economy can grow every year on a compound rate up to infinity. We say that it's the myth, the dominant myth of our times that we have to get rid of. And the growth, first and foremost, signifies that we have to get rid of this myth. At the same time, it also signifies, in the negation of this myth, an organized slowing down. A nice slogan there is to say we have to slow down by design, not by disaster. So what is happening right now is that we experience slowing down by disaster, and that's the only way that capitalist economies can slow down. They can only slow down by disaster, because by design, they are designed to keep pursuing growth. So right now we are experiencing, we're not yet experiencing it, but it's gonna start very soon, probably one of the biggest economic crises and slowdowns of our lifetime, of many of us, if not all of us. No? People say as big as the Great Depression of the 20s. We'll see how it looks. I mean, it's not definite how will this look, what form will it take, and what impact will have on the lives of each one of us, also in different places of the world. But it's precisely in the moments like that the imaginary and the myth of growth comes out stronger, no? Because it's exactly in moments like that we hear, now is not the moment to criticize growth. Now is not the moment to start putting these sustainability or ecological questions on the table. Now it's the time to relaunch the economy, one last stimulus, one last effort to keep it growing, and then again we're gonna have the luxury to discuss these things, But as we know well, when the economy keeps going, then again it's not the time to rock the boat until we wait for the next crisis, no? So our argument is that on the one hand, this crisis, of course, is not degrowth, because by degrowth we do not mean a reduction of the GDP, and we do not mean a collapse of GDP by disaster. This crisis, what is happening right now, is an illustration of what we call the tragedies of growth. It's a tragedy in the sense of states investing all their resources and all their money to pursue GDP growth and leaving their social infrastructures and the public health infrastructures behind. It's unimaginable that an economy as big and as strong as that of the United States could not prepare and deal with a pandemic in a more effective way, and other economies, Spain including. It is also a disaster of growth in the sense that the increasing frequency of diseases and pandemics are directly linked to the encroachment of economies on pristine environmental areas, on the acceleration of the economy, on traveling, on aviation, on how quickly this virus went from one part of the world to another, and also in complicated ways to the agri-food system, which is also an essential part of growth economies. So in that sense, what we are living is a disaster of growth, is not degrowth. This doesn't mean that we that advocate degrowth should shy away from engaging with what is happening right now. And what we argue with Susan and Federico and Giacomo in our book is that precisely in moments of crisis like that, the proposals that we were making for degrowth on how to reallocate resources from non-essential to essential parts of the economy. For example, to transforming the energy system, transforming the transportation system, investing in care. Arguments that we made about work sharing, working less and sharing when and how much we work. Arguments we made about a basic care income, a basic income that the state can guarantee for everyone. So proposals that we already had there in a context of a climate crisis or an ecological crisis or an economic crisis, they are very pertinent right now. Actually, I would dare to argue that they are the natural and the best way that states could respond to this crisis right now. Unfortunately, as we know, that's not how the majority of states are going to respond, because how they respond is not, they don't do the best possible things for the majority of people, but they do the best possible thing for the most powerful people, and the most powerful people right now want to see their profits and their activities growing again. So they're gonna try to push growth at all costs. What might be different this time is that just putting money in the markets, printing money or applying austerity, etc., is not gonna relaunch the economy. So this crisis is much more complicated than the previous ones. And this means that there's gonna be much more opportunity for struggle to promote some of these alternative ideas and open up space, intellectual and practical, for these alternative ideas that we advocate as degrowth. Thank you.
Thank you, Giorgos. Thank you, all 5 participants. We have a little over 30 minutes for conversation, sometimes called Q&A, among 186 extremely considerate participants who have muted themselves splendidly. I would propose this, that we take a kind of 2-prong approach to the conversation, and that is that people can freely use the chat, as well as you can raise your hands if you know Zoom, if you know Zoomish, by going to participants and hitting the raise hand function, and that will create a stack of people. I see your hand, Azriel. And if you want to put yourselves in the picture, so to speak, and so we can see you, that would be awesome too. And what I'd like to do is collect questions rather than go one by one with 5 answers. So we're going to spend 15 minutes or so now gathering questions, and I'll ask the people who speak their questions by being called on to be concise as possible. Not necessarily brief. Concise means just get right to your best comment. It doesn't have to be a question. And I wish this was going on for 24 hours so we could all do it, or I could put you in breakout groups, which I can do, but I'm not going to. So I'm going to keep an eye on who wants to speak by raising their hands, and we're all going to keep an eye on the chat. And questions will happen, so that in the last 10 or 15 minutes, we'll have one final go round where each of our 5 speakers, 4 in-person speakers, will respond as best they can to everything on the table. Oh, so we have people who don't know how to raise their hand, like my friend Noah. in Brazil. So I'm going to start with Noah and with Azriel in Sweden. But to raise your hand, guys, click on participants at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and ideally you have a little raise hand function, and I'll see it if you do that. So over to you, Noah.
Hello, thank you everyone for the amazing talk, and thank you John and all the organizers. My question is to Alberto Acosta. Do you understand English, or say do it in Spanish and English? Spanish?
But I prefer Spanish.
Bueno, yo leí tu libro, es un gran honor estar aquí juntos escuchándote. Mi pregunta es, el buen vivir tiene las dos bases de la relación con la naturaleza y la organización social comunitaria. Y mi pregunta es sobre la relación entre esos dos ejes. Yo, de lo que conozco de experiencias comunitarias andinas y amazónicas, tienen una relación muy fuerte con la naturaleza, una conexión, pero al mismo tiempo son muchas veces muy jerárquicas, hasta despóticas de alguna manera. ¿Y qué podemos aprender de esas experiencias y qué horizonte podemos tener para una organización socio-natural más horizontal, más colectivista, incluyendo a todos los seres? Y voy a decirlo brevemente en inglés. My question was, as the two big principles of the Buen Vivir are communitarian organization and relationship with nature, ecological, then what would be a healthy relation between these two principles? As I saw in some Andinian and Amazonian communities, that social organization is very hierarchical. So what can we learn from those experiences, and what social natural horizons we can project to the future for more collectivist and horizontal organizations? Thank you. Gracias.
Beautiful, thank you, Noah. 3 people figured out how to raise their hands, which is great. We're going to go to Azriel first, and then, sorry, that included Noah, then Vishnu and Nicolas, in that order. Thanks, everyone. Azriel.
Can you hear me? So I can state briefly my questions in English and translate for Alberto in Spanish. So I think basically we agree with each other on almost everything that has been said. So my question addresses another channel. Few people read books today. Then the question is how to translate, to extend this knowledge, this complexity. How is it translated to reach, let's say, the common folk? So that's one of the questions. Thinking on how bloody effective people like Steve Bannon is doing his dirty work in the States and now in Europe, and how the Gramsci, Sorel are better understood by the extreme right. I'm thinking of Swedish Democrats in Europe, Vox in Spain, and so on and so forth. So this is how do we partake and help concretely and effectively in this cultural war. Steve Bannon has phrased it, cultural war. I think it's a good way to define that trench. So Alberto, estaba preguntando, es una inquietud, ¿cómo estamos escribiendo libros y compartimos ideas? pero poca gente lee libros hoy. Los intelectuales leemos libros, ¿no? ¿Cómo llevamos ese mensaje para que sea accesible al nivel de los sectores que votan por la extrema derecha, incluso en contra de sus propios intereses, ¿no? Y eso que se formula en términos de guerra cultural, que es el término que utiliza Steve Bannon, y también la nieta de Le Pen, ahora que abrió una filial en el norte de España. Ellos saben lo que están haciendo. Y han leído y aplican Gramsci y Sorel. Entonces yo creo que esa es una inquietud que yo tengo. Y la otra, the second in English, I think it's basic if we're going to have a chance to influence the outcome of the world after the pandemic, is how to build bridges. So what here, it was very easy for me to be part of build bridges. But when I look at what we call the left, gosh, Ashish, I invited you to be part of a session at the World Forum of Sociology in Porto Alegre about the future of the World Social Forum. And then that was it. An initiative where all the key players could sit at the same table and then have a minimum agreement to move forward, not to be paralyzed as we have been for the last years. And soon another session was constructed on the future World Social Forum, which was an indication that they didn't want dialogue. So I think how to do dialogue, how to bridge and to break this pandemia of the left historical. We are so good at fragmenting and so poor at making the bridges. So this is my second concern. Maybe I translate for Alberto.
I'll jump in because Eduardo and Julian can translate in the chat for Alberto. Thank you for some profound questions. Again, we'll need 24 hours to answer, and I'll speak. But for now, it's Vishnu followed by Nicolas, and that is the whole queue that I know. Okay, Vishnu.
Yeah. Hi, Vishnu here from India. I'm sorry I could not switch on my video. I'm in no state of sharing my video right now. Sorry for that. My question is to Dr. Callis, George Callis. Recently, I happened upon Jason Hickel sharing a paper of Arturo Escobar, where Arturo talks about how degrowth activists can learn from how post-development activists critique of modernity, and how a degrowth is more of a narrative from global north. So my question is this: would that presume that the global south needs to, the state of growth as it is, there is a threshold that we should reach before degrowth can be taken up? And my second question would be, if not, that's not the case, then what are the frameworks of customization that we should adapt for degrowth while practicing it in global south, which is different from the current narrative of degrowth that's happening? Thank you.
Thank you, Vishnu. Nicolas, you're up.
Hi, thank you. I'm a student, Nicholas, at the University of Florida. My question's pretty short. When implementing these ideals, how do we, especially with localization, how do we avoid nationalism and racism that could be like manifestations of the localization? That's my question.
Beautiful, short question. I'm gonna ask one question of my own, and anyone else who wants to ask a question will go after that. My question is always, and all of you have addressed it to one degree or another, but it's the question I can't answer is, how do we build these movements to bring about the pluriverse? So I just thought I'd throw in a little question. And that is my question. That's my burning question throughout my life, even before I knew about the pluriverse. So I think we will take the opportunity of no raised hands. You can still ask a question in the chat or make a comment in the chat, and we'll just have a go around. Let's go around in the opposite order. That would be starting with Georgos to say what he would like to say around any of these issues, or as a kind of attempt to bring things to a provisional closure.
Yeah, on the question that was directly addressed to me on the threshold of growth, I think the questioner already had the answer, no? That's not the idea. That the idea is not that countries that they are lower income or mid-income have to grow up to a point and then start discussing about the growth. The idea is that we have to criticize the idea and the imaginary of growth to open up alternatives in different parts of the world. And we find allies to what we talk about as the growth in the global north. We find them very often in the global south, in other parts of the world. And equally, we find the most staunch and hardcore defenders of the ideology of growth. We also find them in the global south among the elites and also increasingly among the middle classes. So degrowth is one of the words of the pluriverse. That's how I see it, and that's how we see it. It's one of the words of the pluriverse, and it's one word that it is launched within, let's say, the belly of the beast. It's thrown within where the process of colonization and of the reduction of the pluriverse into a single ideology of progress, development, growth started, which is Europe and North America. So we are starting the critique from the places where we live, from the places where we work and struggle, and we throw a keyword against the process of colonization here. But this doesn't mean that this is a word that has to colonize the rest of the world and the movements that they are fighting for different or intellectuals trying to articulate different ideas in other parts of the world. So in that sense, the framework is the pluriverse, no? And if you ask what frameworks would work in other parts of the world, that's precisely, I think, what this book was trying to do, to map out some of these frameworks that work in other parts of the world. And I think this is also what Ashish is doing with the global tapestry of alternatives. So we could think degrowth as one keyword that operates in particular contexts, in particular parts of the world. Now, the question about nationalism and racism and localization is very good and it's very pertinent. And there is nothing automatically or naturally benign or good about localism or localization. I think it's similar to the question about the buen vivir and communities that might be also oppressive or they might be despotic, right? So we should not idealize localism, we should not idealize local communities, but at the same time, we shouldn't think that necessarily they have to end up being closed or they have to be express motives of superiority against those who are not part of the communities, etc. So the challenge with the commons and with communities has always been, how do we manage the openness? How do we manage to balance between openness and closure? How do we manage to have communities that on the one hand reproduce themselves and reproduce their values, and they are not drawn into a universality of globalization, but at the same time, these communities do not become communities of exclusion, do not become nationalist or racist communities. So there's no answer to the question, but it's a recognition that this is a central question that we should constantly ask when we defend localization and local alternatives. And to John's question, and how do we build movements? The way we go about it in our book with Susan, Federico, and Giacomo about degrowth is not to say how should the movement for degrowth be built, but where do we intellectuals writing about degrowth take inspiration from, which actual movements and people inspire us and we feel are in the lines of what we are talking about. Because the discussion between intellectuals and social movements goes two ways, no? We are inspired and we theorize what people are already doing on the ground, and then what we theorize inspires people on the ground. But it's not that we will write the blueprint and then people will have somehow to collaborate and ally to put it in practice, right? And I think John has also argued that extensively. So in our book, we are arguing that the movement for the commons, broadly defined, is where we see the seeds for what we understand as degrowth, where we see these seeds being nourished. And there are many manifestations of the movement of the commons, some explicit and conscious, some also processes of commoning that they are unconscious, some are new and some are continuations of older traditions. And it's there that we position the hope for a transformation in the direction of degrowth or pluriverse or other ideas.
Damn, Georgos, I thought there was a blueprint somewhere. Let's see. Alberto will go next, and Julian Sanchez is on the line to interpret after Alberto has spoken. Over to you, Alberto. Gracias.
Nosotros podemos aprender mucho de las ideas del buen vivir. Esas ideas, esos valores, esas prácticas provienen de comunidades con largas memorias, de comunidades que han sabido construir espacios de relación armónica con la naturaleza. Pero esas comunidades tienen ya más de 500 años de sufrimiento derivado de la conquista y la colonización. Georgios nos decía que no podemos idealizar los localismos. No podemos romantizar la vida de los mundos indígenas, porque esos mundos también están atravesados por la modernidad. Sin embargo, hay muchas cosas que podemos aprender de esas realidades, no para copiarlas y trasladarlas a otros espacios, sino para tratar de identificar cuáles son los elementos fundamentales. Yo señalé dos. Uno, la vida en comunidad de los seres humanos. Somos comunidad. La vida en armonía con la naturaleza. Dos, somos naturaleza. Y tres, lo que podríamos decir desde el mundo indígena, las relaciones espirituales. No necesariamente tiene que ver con religión. Relaciones de respeto, relaciones de solidaridad, relaciones de confianza, resonancia entre seres humanos y seres no humanos. Ahora, esto hay que ajustarlo a cada territorio, pensar en cada realidad. Es mucho más fácil quizás en el campo que lo que puede ser en las ciudades. Hay mucho que aprender, nada para copiar. La idea aquí es, como planteamos con Ashish Kothari, con Federico Demaria, con Ariel Saleh, que viene de Australia, y con Arturo Escobar, abrir la puerta para intercambiar experiencias y construir juntos el pluriverso. La segunda parte, cómo trasladar estas reflexiones a que lleguen a la gente. Yo diría que tenemos que hacer, por un lado, un esfuerzo de consecuencia y de coherencia. Tendríamos que vivir de acuerdo a lo que decimos. Y eso es complicado. Eso es muy complicado, ¿ya? Porque muchas veces estamos hablando de la huella ecológica. Y Alberto Acosta se pasa viajando la mitad del año en aviones, con una mochila ecológica gigantesca. Eso se acabó por lo pronto. Estoy forzado, by disaster, a hacer lo que he venido diciendo, no by design. Y esa es una realidad. Pero hay otro asunto. Tenemos que pensar, los que nos creemos intelectuales, en soluciones de corto plazo sin perder de vista el largo plazo. Porque si solo pensamos en el largo plazo, en las cuestiones cotidianas llegan los mensajes fáciles. No nos olvidemos que terminada la pandemia, nosotros vamos a estar pensando en la gran transformación. La gente va a estar pensando en cómo darse un abrazo, cómo darse un beso, cómo tomarse una cerveza con los amigos y los familiares a los que no los ha visto estos días. Entonces hay que combinar el corto y el largo plazo con mucha alegría y mucha creatividad.
Gracias, Alberto. Julian?
Who wrote for the grants and the people who like got us to the point where we're going to sign papers, you know?
Are you ready, Julian?
I'm ready, but I think Betty needs to mute first. But
oh yeah. I can mute her. Over to you, Julian.
Thank you. Apologies, I wasn't able to get everything, but I did try my absolute best. And here it goes. So the first response was, I believe, to Azril, which is we can learn from the ideas of el buen vivir. Those ideas, morals, and practices come from places of a very old memory. Those communities, those indigenous communities, have flames that have been burning for centuries, ever since the dawn of colonization. We cannot idealize those indigenous worlds because those people are also inflicted and crossed with modernity. There's a lot we can learn from those communities and not copy. Second response was the life of community that we have. The second response was the connection we have with the natural world. And the third point being the relations that we have spiritually. And when you mean spiritually, it's not necessarily religion. Let's practice this in all communities and realities. There's a lot to learn and not to copy. This will open the door to interchange ideas and construct together Pluriverse. And answering the second question, which was, I believe, as real, so I had it flipped, which was answering his question about how we are all writing books and sharing ideas, but not a lot of people read those books and they're not getting those ideas. So he's now answering this question. And that is by coherence, by living. We have to live by what we say, which is a very hard thing to do. Alberto Acosta spends half his life in the plane, not by choice, but by not by design, but just by the circumstances that he's met with. There's another suggestion. We have to think about solutions for the short term and in the long term. We can't lose sight of both. We cannot forget that after the pandemic, we're going to start to learn how to do all the things socially that we once used to do: hugging, kissing, sharing a beer. We have to combine the short and long-term answer solutions with creativity. That's it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Julian, for translating that. And I could not agree more. As I pass the talking stick to Susan.
Hello, thank you to everyone for such a deep conversation and reflection. As we imagine and shape and build our post-everything worlds, struggle to change political, economic institutions is absolutely necessary, but it's not enough. At least in my world, dominant systems, values are deeply embedded in my own practices, my relationships. I viscerally experience them in my body. So I carry with me those assumptions, those hierarchical relationships that Noah pointed out, that humans dominate the rest of nature, or as Nicholas pointed out, certain nations are superior, others are wrong, certain racial or gender groups. And it's really hard to deal with those deep humanistic cultural dimensions of change. And one thing that I've been thinking about as I listen to people talk is the move from universal to pluriversal ways of learning and being. In Latin America, some of us are thinking about an idea that's called sentir pensar. It's about thinking and feeling all wrapped up in one without trying to have an abstract universal truth like Aristotle taught us to do, right? But go down to a local level of embodied knowing, like all of those different experiences Ashish described for us in enlightening perception that are gathered in the Pluriverse and also in our own daily lives, which for me has two dimensions. One, like I tried to describe in my talk, was actually acknowledging the empirical diversity that's there. Don't allow it to go unrecognized and hidden. And the second is practicing with our own bodies some of those values that Alberto talks so beautifully about: reciprocity, conviviality, resilience. And Alberto made a point of saying that they don't play out everywhere the same. So they're not universal abstract thoughts. They're emotionally and physically felt practices that we each play out differently in our own locality. And so those are sort of part of this road that we can move towards a more pluriversal way of responding to these big challenges that we've inherited. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I did not mean to distract with putting some websites up while you were speaking. I just was trying to respond to everyone and one person in particular at the same time. We are going to turn now to Ashish, who started off, and over to you then, Ashish.
Thank you, John. I agree with you. We need 24 hours or much more. This is such a rich bouquet of thoughts and questions. So it's a bit of a shame to have to do it in 2 minutes. But nevertheless, maybe it's the beginning of a conversation for a lot of us. And
take 3 minutes, Ashish. It's okay.
Continuation. All right. And continuation for some of us. So I'm going to try and respond to 2 or 3 of the points, maybe adding to what some of my colleagues have already said. I think Noah's question is absolutely critical because one of the things sometimes we do is to think of things in black and white terms. So the modern system and all of us in the modern system as being the villains of the piece, and the indigenous peoples as being pure and, we have to all go back to that kind, not back, sorry, we all have to go in the direction of what the indigenous peoples are doing. And I agree with her. Certainly from India, we also see that whether it's within ourselves or in the communities that we work with, there are hierarchies, there are inequalities, there are also, many kinds of issues. One of the movements that one of my colleagues, who's actually, I think, on the call, Shrishti, and maybe she can add something, in central India, where indigenous peoples have been fighting against mining and also for self-rule, that is autonomy in some sense. They have also simultaneously been asking questions within themselves of the kind of hierarchies that exist, for instance, between men and women, and trying to create the processes by which women's empowerment can take place so that the kind of decision-making structures that they have for, like a federation of 90 villages together, the women's voice comes in equally as the men. So even as they kind of fight for the revival of or the identity of their cultures, they do recognize that there are issues, that everything is not perfect, even in their own indigenous ways of living and being. And then, of course, at the same time also, as they claim rights, collective rights to forests, to try and protect those forests and the wildlife in them. So I think that's the kind of movement we need to learn from and be part of, to see where, if we think that there are some values that are